Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on contract management. My name's Nicholas Forbes and I'm the Managing Director of Myriad Technologies. As part of my role at Myriad as Managing Director, I get the enviable task of managing all the contracts that flow through Myriad. And essentially when I took that over 2 years ago and started doing it, it was a real interesting challenge trying to get a handle of what actually existed in terms of contracts and how our contracts worked within Myriad. Over that time period, what I've come to realize is that there's essentially a world of contracts, and there's 4 key things to me that make up that world. So first and foremost, and most probably most importantly, is the people aspect of contracts. So what we find is that generally with any contract, although it ends up being a piece of paper with a whole bunch of clauses and things within it, it's the people that negotiate and put together that contract that essentially covers the essence of the contract itself. So as you go through that negotiation process, as you have a team working on a contract, is very much all about the people. The second thing around that world of contracts is businesses. And generally no contract will exist if you weren't having businesses that were negotiating contracts between each other. The third part then is the actual documents and content itself. And finally, the fourth part of that world of contracts for me is all around time. So contracts tend to be very time sensitive, no matter what type of contract it is. Whether you're negotiating a contract that is to do with work for a client, whether you're negotiating an employee agreement, too often those contracts are very time sensitive. Don't get through the negotiations in time, you don't end up with a contract. If you're trying to hire a new employee and you take months to get them an employee contract or a letter of offer, again, that employee is not going to hang around waiting for you. They're going to move on to other opportunities. So if you take those 4 things together, to me, those are the essence of what makes up contract management. It's the people involved, the businesses involved, the paperwork that you end up putting together, and then the time pressures that exist around contract management. So when I first took on this role 2 years ago of looking at contracts, one of the first things I try to do is find out, well, okay, what contracts actually exist within Myriad and what's our obligations under those contracts? And there basically became my first challenge. And that challenge is one of complexity and size and scale. So when I first started looking for those contracts, I tended to find them all over the place. There was no single simple location where I could go to find all the contracts and the bits and pieces around contracts. So it wasn't a single document sitting in a folder somewhere or sitting in SharePoint somewhere. It tended to be spread out all over the place. In some times it was under the client, and sometimes it was under a legal folder, and some of those contracts even existed in people's emails as attachments. And to make things even worse, contracts tend not to be just one single piece of paper or one single document or a single piece of information. It tends to be made up with a whole lot of information. So you have schedules, you have things that input into those contracts. You might have a series of financial worksheets, you might have work breakdowns. There's a whole lot of different things that go into putting an actual contract together. So if you don't have a good management system around how you actually manage that content and work across all of that content, straight away you've got a challenge in trying to understand what are your obligations when it comes to contracts. The other thing is around the complexity of contracts themselves, because contracts are, they never tend to be simple. There's clauses within them, there's schedules, there's ancillary information that needs to be taken into consideration, and then there's the people side of things. So again, it's all about culture, it's about process, it's about the actual content and information itself. And you combine all of those together and you get a level of complexity. The second challenge that I came across is when you're going through drafting a contract and actually putting a contract together, how difficult it can be to actually manage change in contracts. So too often you don't actually control the contract itself. You have other parties that are involved and they tend to work in whatever format they work. They might be working in Word, they might be sending through contracts or schedules in PDFs. And now what you have to do is manage changes as you go through the negotiation process. So it's one thing to sit around a table and have a conversation and to have agreement. It's another thing then to take that agreement, translate it into a set of words that exist within a contract itself. So you do have tools within Word, like compare changes and those sort of things, that does make it easier. But if you've got a complex contract and you're tracking changes in Word, as you can see on the example on the screen at the moment, very quickly that can almost make a contract unreadable. And your challenge that you have around these changes is that a single word can change the whole meaning of the contract. So many years ago within Myriad, there's the example that you're seeing on the screen on the left there is a true example that happened within Myriad. We were doing work for a client to basically put in place an onboarding solution for new employees. And within that contract, we'd specified that any changes to those employees in their life in the company or offboarding of those employees when they left the company were excluded from the contract. And what we'd said is, as I've got on the screen there, work quota does not include changes. What happened is the salesperson, in making some changes to the contract, then removed the word not. By taking out that single word, it is essentially added 150,000 worth of value back into the contract that we were now obligated to perform because of that removal of a single word. And that was on a fairly small contract. So you can imagine on some of these contracts, with construction companies where the contracts are going across millions and millions of dollars, how a single change can have a very real monetary effect on the outcomes of that contract. So the second challenge, the first challenge was complexity around multiple documents, multiple people. The second challenge for me was around how do I actually figure out and manage these changes that come through within contracts. So the third part then is you've done the negotiations, you've signed the contract, we're all good, and we start doing some work. And under that contract, the first thing that a lot of people look at is, okay, when do we get paid under the contract, or when do we have to pay? The second thing people tend to often look at is, well, okay, we now know when we have to be paid. What do we have to do to get paid? And then we tend to forget about the rest of the contract. So what happens is there's a whole lot of obligations that exist typically within contracts that aren't to do with the prime reason for the contract. So for us, maybe a prime reason is implementing a solution for a client. But ancillary to that within the contract is a whole lot of obligations. Things to do with destroyal of electronic documents, things to do around securing information, things to do around intellectual property clauses that supersede and go way beyond the life of the contract itself. And they've got that challenge of your contract might come to an end and have a termination time, but generally within contracts, you'll often find there's obligations that exist, even though the contract has been terminated or come to an end. So again, things like intellectual property clauses very often go beyond the life of the contract itself. So as part of those obligations, and as a bit of an example there, within contracts, you can find clauses that are embedded within those contracts. And an example that I put into payment delays there is essentially if a client delays on paying us, we go off and we own their soul. And too often you can find those small, subtle clauses that are buried within contracts are missed, but have very big implications if particular events happen. So this is something that I needed to get a handle on over the last 2 years. And in order to do that, myself with the team that I work with in Myriad put together some very good solutions around managing contracts and the obligations under contracts. And that solution consisted of Office 365 and all the goodness that exists within Office 365. So things like SharePoint, Planner, Teams, all of those sort of things. But coupled to the technology is not just the technology, it's not all just about the technology. The technology is not going to give you all the answers. Part of what it's about is also changing the culture and the processes that exist within an organization. So if you want to get a really good handle on how to manage your contract, it needs to be a multiple approach or a varied approach of technology combined with people and combined with culture. But to give you an idea of the solutions that we've got in terms of managing contracts, so what I'm going to do is pass across to Hayley, who's going to take you through some examples of how we've done things within Myriad and how we do things for some of our clients using Office 365 and Teams and SharePoint and all of those things. So Hayley, I'll pass across to you.
Thanks, Nick. So before I get into the actual demo, I just wanted to quickly touch on the contract management lifecycle. So generally, when people think about the contract management lifecycle, we're looking at the 5 stages, going from create, through to those negotiations, executing, monitoring, and then closing out and renewing. We took that and like to think of it more as an extended to bring in that obligation management as well, to make sure that we're managing the entire life cycle of the contract, as well as all the obligations sitting underneath it, to make sure that we're fulfilling all of those obligations. So throughout the demonstration today, I'll be showing you how our solution fits each one of those phases of the life cycle. So we'll start off with the creating and how we can create a workspace that can be used no matter how you're receiving the contract. So whether you're creating a contract, you're receiving a contract that's already created, and how you can manage all of the documents and bits and pieces that make up a contract. As Nick pointed out, very rarely is a contract just one single document. So we need to have a way of being able to manage all of those documents together. We'll then show you some tools around how we can manage that negotiation process, how we can manage the documents through that negotiation process, and then how we can execute on the documents. So I'll be showing you two different ways that we can get approval on documents. One is a more internal, so being able to send it for approval. And then for those cases where we do actually need a physical signature, I'll show you how we can actually achieve that and how we can use Adobe Sign to have digital signatures that have all of the encryption and all of the security around them. Once we get into the monitor, I'll show you how we can actually manage all of the obligations, how we can see how they're tracking, where they're up to, make sure that they're all completed. I'll also show you some dashboards that we can place around the monitoring to make sure that we're truly seeing where all of the contracts are up to, and we can manage, see when they're coming up for renewal and those kind of things. I'll then also show you how we can use some other things like Teams and how we can use all of those different tools to be able to manage the entire life cycle. So I'm just going to jump over into our demo environment that we have here. And the first thing that you'll see is that I've got a workspace register. So this is all of the contracts that I have. So this is our primary point of contact. So everything is within this list here. So this tells me all of my contracts, what they're worth, what their start dates are. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new workspace. And it's going to ask for the name of the contract. So you'll notice that the only thing that's mandatory in here is the actual name. At this point, we might not know much more about the contract. On this occasion, I do, so I'm just going to add in some additional metadata. I'm just adding in a start date and an end date for my contract, and the party that I'm entering the contract, and the value. When I click save on that, it's going to go ahead and set up the workspace for me, as well as registering it into my contracts register. So once that sets up, it'll look very similar to this. And I can click into my workspace and I can go ahead and start adding documents in here. So in the case of having a document sent to me, so I might have had contracts that sent to me already that I need to go ahead and get in, I can just pick those up and drag and drop them in. I might also need to start a new contract. So I can go ahead and clicking on new, and I've got all the different kinds of contracts. So I can have whatever kinds of contracts that are applicable to my organisation in here. We've just picked a few that go across most organisations. We can also have templates tied to each of these. So I'm going to go ahead and pick a non-disclosure agreement. And that's going to go and read that template from my corporates template library. So having them all stored in a corporate templates library means that they're a lot easier for me to manage. So if I needed to update terms and conditions, for example, I can just go into that corporate templates library, update it in there, and then it'll roll through to any new documents that I've created from there. Of course, with my corporate templates, I can also have document management around those, so they're going for the appropriate approvals and those kind of things. So once my document's open, you'll see that I've got a non-disclosure agreement here. And I can also have sections within the document that I can either pre-populate from metadata, or I can be pulling information from the contract out as metadata, so I don't have to be retyping information all the time. So I could just click on that and make any additions that I wanted to, and go ahead and save this document. So I'm just going to give this document a name before I save it. And that'll go ahead and save that agreement into my workspace. So that's one of the ways that we can create a new contract within the system. We do have some other ways that we can create contracts. So for example, if we had a new employee starting with us, there would be a whole bunch of documents that we would need to create. So rather than going through and creating a non-disclosure agreement with them, a letter of offer, their employment contract, and creating each of those from scratch, what we can do is we could add them as a new employee to our list, and then using Nintex, we can actually create all of those contracts on the fly. So I'm just going to go ahead here and create a new employee. And some very basic information. I won't fill it all out, but you get the idea. I add in some information around their name, their employment type, when they're going to start, their address, and those kind of things. And then what that's going to do is go ahead and use the templates from my corporate template library and merge all of that information automatically for me. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute when we get to doing the signing. So I'm just going to go back to my workspace register here. So in our scenario, we've got our contracts, we've created them, we've been working together, we've been using all of the co-authoring tools and the version control to be able to manage the contracts through the negotiations. We're now at a point where we need to start getting an approval. So to get that approval, I'm just going to go into my contract here. I'm just going to edit my contract, and you'll notice that it looks very similar to what we started with. So I've still got my contract information at the top. I now have the ability to add an approver. So in this case, Dean has been added, and then I can go ahead and start adding and removing the documents that I want Dean to approve. So again, we might have a number of different versions within here, and we don't want to send all of those for approval. So we want to just be able to select one or two that's going to go to Dean for approval. I'm just going to hit save and send for approval. So what that's going to do is email Dean and ask him to approve those documents. So like I said at the beginning, we've got two different kinds of approvals that we find incredibly useful. So I'm just going to go over to my email here. So the first kind of approval is more that internal approval. So if I needed approval before I sent this contract out to somebody, I might send this through to Nick for approval, for example. So he'd receive an email. It's got all of the information here around the contract, who it's with, the start dates, end dates. It's got all of those documents that I've sent to him for approval, so you can click on those, go ahead and read them. And then once he's happy with it, it's as simple as clicking approved. And that will go ahead and mark that as approved and move it into the next stage of the life cycle. On those occasions where you do actually need to have a signature, we can cater for that as well. Now, these can also be sent to people external. So this kind of approval is very useful for internal approvals, but doesn't always work when it's somebody external. So for those, we can use a signature. So this is my letter of offer that I set up before with Sarah. Again, starting from an email, and it very much walks me through the process of what I need to do. So I need to review and sign this document. So you can see here that it's actually created that letter of offer for Sarah for me. So taking all of that information out of the list that I had, it's gone and it's put Sarah's name, her address, when I'm expecting her to start, the salary that she'll be on, and all of that information that I gave in that list. This can also create a document pack. So in this case, for the example of the demonstration, we're just using one letter of offer, but this could actually be a number of documents. So it could be the letter of offer, employment contract, and any kind of request forms and those kind of things. So Adobe Sign actually walks you through how to fill in this document. So if you've ever had a big document pack where somebody's gone through and put little tabs of initial here, sign here, it's a very similar process. So I can see here that I need to go and start. I just click on that and it's going to walk me through what I need to do. So I need to click here to sign the document. And I'm going to draw, this works better if you have a pencil, but I'll use a mouse. Now it's worth noting that I can do this without having an Adobe Sign account. If I did have an Adobe Sign account, then I would have some additional things available to me, so I can have a signature on file. In my case, I don't, so I need to sign it each time. I'm just going to put my name in here. Click apply. Now I do need to agree to the terms and conditions of using the digital signatures, and clicking on that, and that's going to go ahead and create my document. So that's going to take my signature, place that into that document. It's fully encrypted and very secure. It's also sending a copy to my email, so I have a copy. It's going to send a copy back to SharePoint as well. I could also send that off to other third parties if we needed to. And so that's come through now with my attachment, and it's got my completed signed agreement. So I'm just going to go back over to my contracts management area. So once we've got an executed document, the next part of the process is being able to manage any obligations that we have under that new agreement. I'm just going to go into a contract here. So this is where we can go in and we can start putting in the obligations that we need to do. So I'm just going to edit. And you can see I started to add obligations in. So we can see the contract information growing as it's going through the lifecycle process. So I can go ahead and I can add as many obligations as I have under this contract. Just need to enter in the obligation owner. And of course, when that obligation needs to be completed by. So like I said, you can add in as many obligations for each contract. So for the purposes of the demonstration, we've kept it very simple of being able to just type in those obligations. Now, all of those obligations are tied to that particular contract. So if I'm working on that contract, it's very easy for me to go in and check what obligations we have. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. Somebody like Nicholas, as a managing director, needs to be able to look across the entire organisation, regardless of the contract, and see, what obligations do we have and are they being met? So we can take all of those obligations and pull them out so that we can manage them independent of the contract that they are actually tied to. So I'm just going to click on the obligations here. And this is pulling together all of my obligations across every contract. So I can see what obligations I have, who they're sitting with, what the due dates are, and we can put some intelligence around these. So we can see that this due date has passed and hasn't been met yet, so we can highlight that in red. So it's very easy for somebody to come along and have a look and see, well, these obligations haven't been done, what's happening with them. And then of course I can tie them back to the contract that they came from. So I can open that contract and see where that obligation came from. So we can also take that a step further as well and pull that out into Planner. So I'm just going to go over into Planner here. Planner works on the concept of buckets. So each one of those contracts becomes its own bucket, which then makes it very easy for me to manage all of those obligations within those contracts. So each obligation is a little card that's within that bucket. So this is my contract here, and I've got each of the obligations in here. So I can click on those and open it up to put more information in there. So one of the great features of Planner is the ability to have a checklist. So this obligation might actually have smaller tasks sitting under this obligation. So I can actually manage them on that task level. I'm just going to put in a few items in my checklist. So I can build that out, and then I can use these to mark off and see and keep track of each of those tasks under this particular obligation. I can also mark it as being in progress. I can add some notes. I can have comments. I can type comments in here, and other people could also type comments. So if somebody else was helping me with this obligation, we can actually have discussions and keep track of what we're both doing under this particular obligation. So Planner also allows us to have some charts. So we can go ahead and we can chart out how we're tracking with those obligations on a project, on a contract by contract. So I can see here that under SAM Engineering, I've actually got 2 obligations and they're both overdue at the moment. I can also use Planner to push this out onto a schedule, so I can clearly see when all of my obligations need to be done, where they're due and where they're up to. So Planner gives us some great tools around being able to manage each of the obligations, but we do need a little bit more information and monitoring around each particular contract. So we can do that by building some dashboards. Just going back to my home page here. And we've built out some basic dashboards. So I've got all of my contracts, and then I might need to see all of my approved contracts so that I can manage those. I've got all of my draft contracts so that I can look across these and make sure that they get completed and get approved. We've then got any executed contracts, so if that's all I'm interested in, I don't need to worry about what's in draft, I just need to focus on executed. And of course the contract's expiring shortly, so that I can get on top of those and I can start that renewal and close out cycle. What we've also done though is put some analytics over the top of those contracts to build some more intelligent dashboards. So this is all completely out of the box with some customization, and these can also be further customized. So we've put together some dashboards to give you a really good understanding of where all of your contracts are at the moment. So I can see here that the total value of my contracts is 3.41 million. I've got 1.7 million in executed. I can also see that I've got quite a few contracts in draft. There's a couple that have been approved, but they haven't been executed yet. So I can clearly see, and I can be looking at that and wondering why we're not moving out of approved into executed and what the holdup is there. I can do things like seeing who my most valuable customer is. So we can see here that we've got quite a lot in Sony, a little bit in Microsoft and Contoso here. Now these are also fully interactive, so you can use these to drill down further to get more refined information. So if I was just interested in executed documents, executed contracts, I'm just going to click on what's been executed. And I can see that we've got 416 value in executed, and I can see who they're actually with. So in today's climate at the moment, it's very difficult for people to be able to get into a room and review contracts and collaboratively work on contracts together. So we've been looking at ways that we can stimulate those kind of discussions, but still maintaining social distancing. So we're looking to things like Teams to be able to fulfill that. So what we can do with Teams at the moment is bring all of our contracts out into Teams. They can be individual discussions so that we can still wrap security around them. There's times when we don't want everybody being able to see all of the contracts or see specific contracts, but we can actually then, using Teams, have full discussions and inline discussions around particular documents. So I've just got a contract here. I'm just going to open that one in Teams. So I've still got all of the co-authoring and the version control. You'll see that it's opened in Word. So I can work on the document as I would in Word, but I've also got things like conversations here. So I can go ahead and I can have actual inline conversations with the people who are co-authoring with me. And we can work backwards and forwards in that manner. So again, it's not quite the same as sitting in a room with somebody, but it does get that collaboration and that working together. So they're the demos that I had that I wanted to show you. I'll just hand over now back to Nathan.
All right. Thank you, Hayley, and also thank you, Nick. Before we jump into closing and answering some of the questions that have come through, Nicholas, is there anything else that you'd like to add on the back of Hayley's presentation?
Hi, Nathan. Yeah, I just wanted to mention to people, so Hayley has taken you through, I think, an amazing solution. And I just wanted to tie it back to, the COVID crisis that we've gone through as a real good example of why this is so important. So when the COVID crisis started, one of the first things we did at Myriad is turn towards our contracts. So things just like a simple thing like our rental agreement, and going through the terms of our rental agreement to see, what terms we had, what our obligations were. Going through our managed services contracts, going through our client contracts, contracts with vendors, all of those sort of things. So, at the start of the COVID crisis, it was an exercise that we had to do that was very easy for us to actually do that exercise. So to be able to find executed contracts like a rental agreement was a 1 minute process versus a go hunt it down across a number of people, number of different locations. So it's very often, this is when it becomes most critical, is in these crisis moments, and the crisis might be something as big and as bad as COVID has been, but it might be just be at the crisis might be caused around something that's happened on a individual piece of work. So there's very often this concept of contract management tends to be ignored till a event actually happens, and then you start to realize how important it is. So I just wanted to add that in. Thanks, Nathan.
All right. Thank you, Nicholas. All right. Well, thank you for attending today. Hopefully you've all found it insightful and come across or found some tools, techniques, or capabilities that can help you manage not just in the current crisis that we're all facing with a lot of people working from home, but can also see a path as to how you might be able to use it to work more efficiently and start to digitize what was previously seen or is still seen as a fairly specialized capability into the future as we all start to return to our normal working locations and offices. Now, we will leave this stream on for another 5-10 minutes if you'd like to ask any questions. We have had some questions come through that aren't quite suited to just a simple text response. So Hayley, our first question that's come through is, can we use the signing capability with documents beside just Word?
So that's a great question. I have been able to do PDFs before. So Word and PDFs, are there any other file types that you would be looking at needing to do digital signatures with?
All right, well, we wait for an update on that one. The next question that we've had come through is, can we extend the obligation management into project and job management? So happy to take that one. Once we have an understanding of what the obligations are and using the workflow tools, we can start to extend out what those or share that information across into specific project management or job management spaces or other systems using things like Nintax to integrate that information. Another question that we've had, what does a typical implementation look like and how long to get the solution working? So Hayley.
So typical implementation and how long really come down to how far from what we've put together your specific processes are. So we generally find that what we've put together is about an 80-20 fit, where it's 80% of what you need, and then we might need to do about 20% customization. So they're not months worth of work, so we can have them in within a month or so, depending on your specific processes and your specific approvals.
All right. Next question was, do you provide training and manuals for the solution? So happy to take that one. Yes, so we have a long-standing history with not just delivering, but also creating training for different business solutions. So with the solution, we can provide all the way from CBT based or within the solution itself, things like quick reference guides, through to more formalized classroom-based training or remote classroom-based training, but also training for administrators and owners of the system as well as to how to manage, update, and enhance as needed. Next question, can we integrate this with accounting systems for financial management? So Hayley.
On a general, yes, we would need to look at what your specific accounting is and how we would interact with it.
Excellent. And final question, do I need any specific licensing for this solution? So happy to take that one. A lot of what you've seen is out of the box Microsoft 365. Depending on what type of 365 license you have, so E1 through to E5, does depend on what tools and functions you get. So things like Power BI is a good example. For the workflow capability and the document generation and the electronic signing, we are using Nintex, which is a licensable third-party add-on for it as well. Depending on the complexity of what you specifically need, we can have discussions around what you get with if you don't have those tools, or what the licensing cost would be to move up to a higher version or add those products as well. All right, and final question is, how configurable is the solution overall? So Hayley, would you like to take that one, please?
Sure. The short answer is very configurable. We have put a lot of effort into making it, like I said, fit an 80%. So it fits most of the use cases, and then there's just that last 20% that we configure on a case-by-case basis. But it's designed to be able to meet the needs of any organization, really. So we can change any of the approvals, modify those, and configure it and customize it to each individual company.
All right, thanks, Hayley. That's a good segue. Well, while we're waiting for any other questions to come through, if you do have other questions that come up, or if you share the content out, which we will be sharing with everyone on the stream at the end of today, do feel free to get in touch, either for a more personalized demonstration or to talk to us about what some of your specific requirements or processes around contract management would be. Now, once again, we'll leave it open for a few more minutes just in case there's any last questions. Otherwise, thank you all for joining and enjoy your weekend.